Great Depression. The Great Depression. Throughout the Roaring '20s, the U.S. economy nearly doubled its wealth, leading to reckless overspeculation on Wall Street, which reached its peak by August of 1929. Combined with declining industrial output, rising unemployment, a widespread drought in multiple farming regions, and a banking sector bloated with questionable loans, conditions morphed into a perfect storm that exploded on Wall Street on October 24, 1929. Known as Black Thursday, panicked investors sold off a record 12.9 million shares, followed 5 days later by the Black Tuesday sell-off of an additional 16 million shares, wiping out millions of individual fortunes while setting the stage for widespread bank failures as their individual solvency grew challenged by loan defaults. As consumer confidence eroded in the wake of Wall Street's collapse, a decrease in industrial production led to even higher unemployment, lower wages, and decreased consumer buying power. By 1931, the nation's industrial production had dropped by half, and as bread lines and soup kitchens formed in cities across the nation, so did the growing number of homeless people, as well as a dust bowl in the southern plains that prompted additional mass migrations of destitute farmers seeking employment in cities. By its peak in 1933, the Great Depression witnessed a national unemployment rate of 20%, while thousands of regional banks had closed their doors for good. Known as a laissez-faire Republican, President Herbert Hoover's failure to intervene on an ailing economy led to the naming of homeless encampments as Hoovervilles, as well as a landslide victory for presidential candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt in the election of 1932, who famously encouraged downtrodden Americans that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. FDR's fireside chats soon projected optimism and calm over a jittery nation, which he turned into action with his New Deal policies, including the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Works Progress Administration that gave government-funded infrastructure employment to 8.5 million Americans from 1932 to 1943. He also sought reforms in the financial sector, including the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, which protected individual bank accounts with government-backed assurances, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, which applied regulation and oversight on all stock and commodity markets intended to prevent the kinds of abuses that led to the stock market crash of 1929. While early signs of recovery became measurable in the spring of 1933, a sharp downturn occurred 4 years later, largely inspired by the Federal Reserve's decision to increase its requirements for money held in federal coffers, in turn creating a contraction that zeroed out most of the gains witnessed since 1933. Nor were Depression-era hardships limited to America, which helped to fuel the rise of extremist political movements in Europe, including Adolf Hitler's ascension to power in 1933 Germany. Following Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939, the WPA switched its emphasis to strengthening American military infrastructure, followed by a massive increase in defense manufacturing after FDR's decision to support Britain and France in their struggle against Nazi aggression. While most historians place the end of the Great Depression in 1939, the true economic turnaround occurred in 1941, after the U.S. entered World War II following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, making the Great Depression one of the worst hard times in American history. The stock market crash of 1929. During the Roaring '20s, overconfidence in the U.S. economy and the stock market saw the Dow Jones Industrial Average shoot up to an all-time high on September 3, 1929, topping out at 381 points. To further set the stage for disaster, ordinary citizens with little financial acumen borrowed money from their stockbrokers by putting down as little as 10% of the share price, which artificially drove up stock values almost 20% annually from 1922 until the Great Crash. The perfect storm worsened in August of 1929, just weeks before disaster, when the Federal Reserve Bank of New York raised interest rates from 5% to 6%. Some economists believe this steep and quite sudden hike in interest rates cooled investor enthusiasm, which affected market stability and sharply reduced the economic expansion trends of the 1920s. Still considered the worst economic disaster in world history, the great stock market crash of 1929 began on Thursday, October 24th, when skittish investors began selling off 12.9 million shares of corporate equities. On October 28th, known as Black Monday, the Dow plunged 13%, followed by an additional 12% drop on Black Tuesday. The crash wiped out fortunes both great and small in one fell swoop, setting the stage for the Great Depression of the 1930s. Although the number of crash-inspired suicides has been exaggerated, to some, a quick death seemed like the only way out. People who had worked 30 and 40 years on Wall Street lost everything in a period of days. For example, a Wall Street worker wrote in a letter after the crash, "Conditions down in the financial neighborhood have been such that they keep us working. Yesterday, a woman jumped from the roof of our building, 44 floors, right past our window. I saw her body lying in the street, and the sight was so harrowing that I became half sick." The Wall Street crash soon rippled out across the nation, undermining Americans' faith in their fragile banking system, which at the time was made up of thousands of small-town banks that lacked the size and reputation to convince Americans that their money was safe. Ordinary citizens rushed to withdraw their money from these banks, soon discovering that their money had been lost on Wall Street. As confidence in the American economy eroded, by 1931, over 2,000 banks had failed. What little money Americans had left went into their mattresses instead of banks, while mass corporate bankruptcies soon followed, since businessmen could no longer procure the necessary credit that had fueled their cash flow needs during the boom years of the 20s. High unemployment and a worse hard time was to follow throughout most of the 1930s, not to be fully shaken off until America's entry into World War II. Hoovervilles of the Great Depression. At the height of the Great Depression, when 1 in 4 eligible workers found themselves homeless and unemployed, hundreds of shantytown slums sprang up across the nation, housing hundreds of thousands of destitute Americans. Disillusioned citizens called them Hoovervilles, referring to the commonly held belief that Republican President Herbert Hoover was a do-nothing leader who passed responsibility for the rampant homeless epidemic onto local governments and charities. Homelessness was certainly present long before the Great Depression, making the condition a common sight in most American cities well before the Black Tuesday stock market crash of 1929. Most cities built municipal lodging houses for their homeless until the Great Depression exponentially increased demand for limited public housing. As a result, massive Hoovervilles formed around soup kitchens, usually trespassing on private lands, yet tolerated or ignored out of dire necessity. Some Hooverville residents possessed construction skills, allowing them to build their houses out of stone, but the vast majority resorted to building their residences out of wood from crates, cardboard, scraps of metal, or whatever materials they could find. When a Hooverville formed near the reservoir in New York Central Park, the residents were hastily evicted by the police. As the Depression wore on, however, public sentiment became more sympathetic, and in July 1931, a judge suspended the sentences of 22 unemployed men sleeping in Central Park, giving each of them $2 out of his own pocket. "We work hard to keep clean," one of the men said to the judge, "because that's important. I never lived like this before." In 1932, Democratic presidential candidate Franklin D. Roosevelt campaigned for the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. After his election to the White House, at his direction, Congress passed a series of emergency measures known as the New Deal for the American people, forging a new government agency known as the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. The program would grow to employ 8.5 million people and spend over $11 billion as it transformed the nation's infrastructure by putting Americans back to work. Herbert Hoover. Born in West Branch, Iowa in 1874, later to become the first U.S. president born west of the Mississippi, Herbert Clark Hoover was orphaned at age 9, forced to move to Oregon to be raised by an uncle. After attending Quaker schools up through high school, Hoover studied geology at Stanford University before traveling the world in search of valuable mineral deposits, growing rich from his entrepreneurial mining operations that made him a multi-millionaire. He married his college sweetheart, Lou Henry, in 1899, and together they raised 2 boys to adulthood. After the start of World War I, Hoover dedicated himself to humanitarian works, helping to repatriate 120,000 stranded American tourists caught in Europe when hostilities commenced, later coordinating the delivery of food and supplies into Belgium following Germany's invasion and occupation. After President Woodrow Wilson appointed Hoover director of the Food Administration, Hoover became a household name when he encouraged Americans to reduce their consumption of meat to ensure that adequate supplies of food and clothing could fully reach and support Allied troops in Europe. At war's end, Hoover earned worldwide acclaim when he arranged shipments of food to destitute Europeans, receiving thousands of thank you letters from those who had benefited from what Europeans called Hoover lunches. Hoover's success later earned him appointments in the Harding and Coolidge administrations, finally ascending to the White House in the landslide presidential election of 1928. Much to his bad fortune, 7 months after taking office, America entered the Great Depression after the stock market crash of 1929, which forced unemployed Americans onto food lines and shanty towns that became known derisively as Hoovervilles. A political conservative, Hoover believed strongly that excessive federal intervention into the nation's failed economy posed a threat to capitalism, causing most Americans to view Hoover as callous, insensitive, and uncaring over the plight of so many destitute Americans. As a result, Hoover was soundly defeated in the presidential election of 1932, ushering in Franklin D. Roosevelt, who would become the only 4-term president in American history. After his single term in office, Hoover became a prominent and persistent critic of FDR's New Deal policies, writing articles and books that warned against excessive power in the federal government. He returned to public service in the 1950s, serving on government efficiency commissions for the administrations of Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower. He passed away at age 90 in 1964, at a time when his legacy had grown more favorable, after Americans saw 8 more years of Great Depression hardship, despite Roosevelt's New Deal attempts to stimulate the economy. Black blizzards and the Dust Bowl. Coinciding with the Great Depression of the 1930s, another worst hard time, the Dust Bowl was a period of severe dust storms that fiercely damaged the ecology and agriculture of the American and Canadian prairies, caused by a protracted drought and the failure by farmers to apply dryland farming techniques to prevent wind erosion. Despite near desert-like topography, in the decades following the Civil War, farmers flocked to the region under the false assumption that rain would follow the plow. The region prospered in the first 3 decades of the 20th century due to advances in farming such as the mechanized tractor, improved irrigation techniques, and an unprecedented period of abundant rainfall. From 1900 to 1920, the amount of farmland in the region doubled, and from 1925 to 1930, the amount of cultivated land nearly tripled. During these same periods, farmers employed techniques that depleted nutrient-rich topsoil that led to widespread erosion, Heavy plowing led to the eradication of deep-rooted grasses that held the prairies intact, followed by a severe drought that afflicted the region for the entirety of the 1930s. The heart of the Dust Bowl was comprised of an approximate 100 million acres, encompassing the panhandles of Texas and Oklahoma, western Kansas, and large swatches of eastern New Mexico and Colorado. As the drought intensified, lung-choking dust storms became known as black blizzards. The worst of these fell on April 14, 1935, when it hit Beaver, Oklahoma around 4 p.m., Boise City around 5:15, and Amarillo, Texas at 7:20. Avis Carlson was caught in the midst of this most deadly black blizzard. People caught in their own yards grope for their doorsteps. Cars come to a standstill, for no light in the world can penetrate this swirling murk. The nightmare is deepest during the storms, but on the occasional bright day and the usual gray day, we cannot shake from it. We live with the dust, we eat it, we sleep with it. We watch it strip us of possessions and the hope of possessions. Intense efforts were made to correct the problem, including crop rotations, contour plowing, and terracing. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted more than 200 million trees from Texas to Canada in an attempt to block the wind and hold the soil in place. Unable to pay mortgages or grow crops, the Dust Bowl forced tens of thousands of poverty-stricken families to abandon their farms. Known as Okies, these destitute people migrated en masse to California and other states, only to discover that the Great Depression had rendered these regions only mildly better than the conditions they were forced to flee. The bonus Expeditionary Forces of 1932. In 1924, 5 years before the stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent decade-long Great Depression, Congress enacted the World War Adjusted Compensation Act, which awarded World War I veterans a certificate of payment not to be redeemed until 1948. When the Great Depression stripped many of these veterans of jobs and a roof over their heads, approximately 43,000 veterans and their families descended upon Washington, D.C. to demonstrate for early payment of their certificates. Known as bonus marchers of the bonus Expeditionary Forces, the protesters established a Hooverville or shanty town along the banks of the Anacostia River in central Washington.
I came to Washington to get my bonus, and I'm going to wait for it till I get it if I have to wait till 1945.
What that brought you to Washington?
Well, to beat the undertaker, spend the money before the undertaker gets it.
I know who's made this country worth living in. It's just you fellas. Look, makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No.
While many Americans unfairly blamed President Herbert Hoover for worsening the Great Depression through inadequate economic policy, on July 28th, he further tanked his reputation by ordering the bonus marchers forcefully removed from government land. Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur and his subordinate understudies George S. Patton and Dwight D. Eisenhower led a contingent of 500 infantrymen, 500 cavalrymen, 6 M1917 light tanks, and 800 policemen into the bonus marchers' Hooverville, unleashing tear gas and firearms when the protesters refused to leave their encampment. Just as the veterans had endured mustard gas attacks in the trenches of Europe, this time the gassing would be delivered by their own countrymen. 2 veterans would die the next day from gunshot wounds received by overzealous police officers, while a total of 1,017 veterans and their wives and children would be injured. Once the bonus marchers were successfully routed from their encampment, their dwellings and personal belongings were summarily burned to the ground. After news of the violence spread throughout the country, Americans were largely horrified by the violent treatment applied to these once heroic veterans of World War I, further eroding Hoover's image as a compassionate leader. 3 months later, he would be voted out of office when Franklin D. Roosevelt captured 57.4% of the popular vote, carrying 42 states and nearly 88% of the electoral vote. The Presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Born into a prominent family in Hyde Park, New York, including his fifth cousin and 26th American president, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was educated in such prestigious institutions as the Groton School, Harvard College, and Columbia Law School. After practicing law for several years, FDR entered politics at the state level, including one federal post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Woodrow Wilson. In the 1932 presidential election, Roosevelt defeated Republican incumbent Herbert Hoover in a landslide victory, kicking off the only four-term presidency in American history. Considered one of the most influential figures in world events during the first half of the 20th century, FDR would lead the nation through the Great Depression during his first two terms in office, followed by World War II in his third and ultimately truncated fourth terms as president. During the Great Depression, FDR built his New Deal coalition, which would define modern liberalism in the U.S. throughout the middle third of the 20th century. During the first 100 days of Roosevelt's first term in office, FDR moved decisively to end prohibition by amendment to the U.S. Constitution, followed by a slew of legislative initiatives focused on stimulating a collapsed American economy. Along with the passage of 12 major laws, almost every American found something to be pleased about and something to complain about in FDR's robust collection of bills, but it was clear to all that FDR was engaging in the sort of direct and vigorous action he had promised in his inaugural address.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Stricken by polio in 1921, few Americans knew that FDR was bound to a wheelchair, which in the days before television was something a public leader could still keep from the limelight. He used radio to speak directly to the American people, giving 30 fireside chat addresses during his long reign as president.
This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well.
After Japan's unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor, FDR would lead the nation through yet another turbulent passage in American history, providing reassurance and resolve to a nation's laser-like determination to eradicate totalitarian aggression.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Not 3 months into his fourth term in office, the weight of his leadership role in World War II saw a drastic decline in FDR's health. On April 12, 1945, some 5 weeks before Victory Day in Europe, FDR passed away from a massive cerebral hemorrhage at his Little White House retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia, not 3 months into his fourth term in office, bringing to an end one of the most revered presidents in American history. Today, FDR's surviving programs and legislation include the Securities and Exchange Commission, the National Labor Relations Act, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Social Security, and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Eleanor Roosevelt. Born into a wealthy family in 1884 New York City, after her mother died when Eleanor Roosevelt was 6 years old, followed by her alcoholic father 2 years later, Eleanor was raised by her grandmother in Manhattan and Tivoli, New York. A serious and awkward child, Eleanor was educated by private tutors until age 15, spending the next 3 years at a private girls' school in England, before returning stateside to marry the future four-term President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, her fifth cousin once removed. The couple would raise 6 children, 5 of whom survived into adulthood, as FDR rose first into New York politics before his ascension to the White House in 1933. Eleanor reluctantly surrendered her active role in the American Red Cross and the New York Democratic Party, not to mention her teaching post at an exclusive Manhattan girls' school, instead transforming the role of First Lady from a mere social hostess to an active and vocal participant in her husband's administration, championing civil rights for African Americans, labor rights for American workers, while encouraging her husband to appoint more women into federal positions. She also held hundreds of press conferences with female reporters, who were typically barred from White House press conferences, at the same time writing a syndicated newspaper column entitled My Day from December 1935 until her death in 1962, creating one of the most notable political partnerships in American presidential history after FDR died suddenly of a cerebral hemorrhage in 1945 in the company of Eleanor's old social secretary, Lucy Mercer, an extramarital affair that had rekindled after Eleanor threatened to leave her husband some years earlier. Eleanor continued her vocal support of the civil rights movement by supporting the anti-lynching bill, which prompted an irate Ku Klux Klan to post a $25,000 bounty on her head. Appointed chair of the UN's Human Rights Committee by President Harry S. Truman, Eleanor went on to deliver her most famous speech, The Struggle for Human Rights. Authoring 27 books in more than 8,000 columns over the course of her lifetime, Eleanor passed away in Manhattan on November 7, 1962, from aplastic anemia, tuberculosis, and heart failure, making Eleanor Roosevelt one of America's greatest national treasures. Fiorella La Guardia. Born in 1882 Greenwich Village, New York, the son of an Italian immigrant father and a Jewish mother from Trieste, early in his political career, Fiorella La Guardia won and lost a string of elected offices, including 2 congressional seats in the U.S. House of Representatives and president of the New York City Board of Aldermen. Elected mayor of New York City in 1933 as a Fusion Party candidate, soon to crush a centuries-long string of corrupt Tammany Hall bosses, the 5-foot-tall portly Republican was fluent in a number of languages, including Italian, German, Yiddish, and Croatian, which combined with his energetic can-do personality to resonate with the melting pot diaspora of New York City's immigrant voter base for the next 12 years to come. Considered by many political historians as the greatest mayor in U.S. history, La Guardia criticized the gangsters who brought negative stereotypes to New York's thriving Italian community, going after bosses like Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello in his frequent radio addresses, stating, "Let's drive the bums out of town." In 1934, after rounding up thousands of Costello's one-armed bandits, La Guardia bashed a number of slot machines with a sledgehammer before dumping them ceremoniously into the Long Island Sound. Working with special prosecutor and future Republican presidential candidate Thomas E. Dewey, La Guardia led a successful investigation into Luciano's prostitution ring, eventually sending the mob boss to prison on a 30 to 50-year sentence. During the hardscrabble years of the Great Depression, La Guardia's close relationship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his New Deal reforms witnessed $1.1 billion in federal stimulus money pour into New York City infrastructure projects, working closely with La Guardia's powerful Parks Commissioner Robert Moses to build the West Side Highway, the East River Drive, Brooklyn's Battery Tunnel, the Triborough Bridge, plus 2 regional airports, now known as LaGuardia and JFK, at the same time presiding over the 1939 World's Fair at Flushing Meadows and the public takeover of the New York City subway system. Shortly before America's entry into World War II, FDR appointed LaGuardia as the first director of the Office of Civilian Defense, or OCD, giving LaGuardia full oversight over the mobilization of thousands of volunteers in such capacities as air raid wardens and the creation of blackout protocols the installation of air raid sirens and shelters, in the worrisome likelihood that German or Japanese bombers could someday reach American shores. He also created the Civil Air Patrol, juggling 3 days a week in Washington as OCD director, followed by 4 days a week as New York City's mayor. He passed away from pancreatic cancer on September 20th, 1947, making Fiorella La Guardia one of the boldest leaders in 20th century America. FDR and the New Deal. On March 4th, 1933, during the bleakest days of the Great Depression, newly elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his first inaugural address before 100,000 people on Washington's Capitol Plaza.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
After assuring Americans that he would wage a war against the emergency, the following day, Roosevelt declared a 4-day bank holiday to stop people from withdrawing their money from teetering banks. And on March the 9th, Congress passed Roosevelt's Emergency Banking Act, which reorganized the banks and closed the ones that remained hopelessly insolvent. In his first fireside chat, Roosevelt urged Americans to put their savings back into banks, and by the end of the month, almost 3/4 of all American banks had reopened their doors. During the first 100 days of Roosevelt's first term in office, FDR moved decisively to end prohibition by amendment to the U.S. Constitution, followed by the signing of the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, or TVA, which allowed the federal government to build dams along the Tennessee River for both flood control and the generation of inexpensive hydroelectric power. Simultaneously, Congress passed a bill that paid farmers to fallow their fields in order to end agricultural surpluses and boost food prices. The following month saw the enactment of the National Industrial Recovery Act, which guaranteed workers the right to unionize and negotiate for higher wages and better working conditions. Along with the passage of 12 other major laws, almost every American found something to be pleased about and something to complain about in FDR's robust collection of bills. But it was clear to everyone that FDR was engaging in the sort of direct and vigorous action he had promised in his inaugural address. Despite FDR's efforts to stimulate the economy, the Depression worsened with high unemployment and low wages, obliging Roosevelt to launch a second, more aggressive series of New Deal programs in the spring of 1935. Known as the Second New Deal, he created the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, providing federally funded jobs for the unemployed, which in turn improved the American infrastructure through the construction of post offices, bridges, schools, highways, and parks. Along with additional legislation to protect labor unions, in August of 1935, FDR signed the Social Security Act, which guaranteed pensions for working Americans, as well as unemployment insurance for workers laid off for reasons outside their own conduct or performance. Most historians concur that Roosevelt's New Deal era came to an abrupt end on December 8, 1941, when the United States entered World War II, just 1 day after the Japanese bombed American naval assets at Pearl Harbor. The Social Security Act. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, elder care and support was generally provided by family and friends within largely agrarian societies, while early in the 17th century, Great Britain established poor laws, which was the first time that a government acknowledged its responsibility to the elderly, the disabled, and the less fortunate of her citizens. After the Pilgrims brought England's poor laws with them into the New World, the first major American public assistance program began during the Civil War, when the federal government began making payments to hundreds of thousands of disabled veterans or their widows and orphans left behind by a veteran's ultimate sacrifice. Beginning in the 1870s, the Industrial Revolution dramatically reshaped the American landscape, enticing many to leave family farms for expanding job opportunities available within industrialized cities. While rising urbanization ushered in improved sanitation, increased life expectancy, and affluence for many Americans, the divide separating the elderly, the disabled, and the less fortunate became much more apparent, while the Great Depression left millions of Americans unemployed, underfed, and desperate for outside help. That all changed when President Franklin D. Roosevelt implemented his New Deal policies intended to offer a hand up to struggling Americans, including the Social Security Act of 1935. Borrowing a concept first employed in Europe, FDR proposed a system in which working-age Americans contributed part of their income into a payroll tax maintained by their employer, setting in motion a perpetual means of compensation to the retired generation of workers who came before them. After a period of heated debate in both houses of Congress, FDR signed the Social Security Act into law on August 14, 1935, which in turn created a retirement pension program, an unemployment insurance program funded by employers, health insurance for people experiencing temporary financial distress, financial aid for widows with children, and financial assistance to disabled individuals. A little more than a week after its rollout, more than 1 million Americans had enrolled in the program, receiving Social Security cards that bore their unique Social Security number, while 4 months later, 26 million Americans now used their Social Security numbers to track their earnings and accrued benefits, making the Social Security Act an ongoing safety net for Americans everywhere. The spy behind home plate. Born into a Jewish immigrant family in 1902 Harlem, New York, Morris Mo Berg excelled at both academics and baseball, first at NYU, before matriculating to Princeton University, where he batted a respectable .337, while his batting average against arch-rivals Harvard and Yale soared to a dazzling .611. Graduating magna cum laude in 1923, Berg signed a $5,000 contract as a backup shortstop with the Brooklyn Robins, soon to be renamed the Brooklyn Dodgers, where one teammate recalled that Berg could speak 12 languages, but he couldn't hit in any of them. Exiled to the minor leagues after hitting a dismal .186 his first season with the pros, Berg spent the next 2 years developing as a player with the Minneapolis Millers, the Toledo Mud Hens, and the Reading Keystones, earning his law degree from Columbia before signing with the Chicago White Sox from 1926 to 1930, the Cleveland Indians during the 1931 and 1934 seasons, the Washington Senators from 1932 to 1934, and later the Boston Red Sox from 1935 to 1939. During his time inside the Beltway, Berg became a frequent guest at embassy cocktail parties, where his good looks, quick wit, and prodigious language skills caught the attention of the incoming administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And while history has failed to reveal who officially put him on the roster, Berg was selected to join an all-star team bound for an 18-game goodwill exhibition trip to Japan, where he carried a letter signed by U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, instructing the staff at the American consulate in Tokyo to give the catcher all due cooperation, official and otherwise. He also carried a 16mm movie camera provided by Movietone News, who contracted with Berg to film his trip for moviegoers back home. During his downtime, Berg traded his baseball uniform for a kimono, and while the Japanese government strictly forbade photography of any kind by visiting foreigners, the 6'1" baseball player slicked back his hair and boldly filmed much of Tokyo's industrial and military infrastructure, including footage that would later be viewed by U.S. Army Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle and his raiders before their now famous 1942 bombing raid on Tokyo, making Moe Berg both a mediocre journeyman baseball player and an excellent pre-war spy. The Works Progress Administration. Created by executive order on May 6, 1935, President Franklin D. Roosevelt created the WPA, later renamed the Works Progress Administration in 1939, designed to employ Americans in the construction of infrastructure projects during the darkest days of the Great Depression. Created at a time when a whopping 20% of American adults were out of work, by 1938, Roosevelt's WPA employed some 3.3 million largely unskilled American men in the construction of 4,000 new school buildings, 130 new hospitals, as well as the construction of 9,000 miles of storm drains and sewer lines. The program also saw the construction of 29,000 bridges and 150 airports, while planting 24 million trees and paving or repairing 280,000 miles of roadway. Thanks to Eleanor Roosevelt's lobbying efforts aimed at her husband, the WPA also oversaw Federal Project No. 1, or simply Federal 1 as it was known, which employed artists, musicians, actors, and writers to further bolster the ranks of the employed, at the same time inspiring downtrodden Americans with the creation of hopeful artwork and performances amidst crippling economic uncertainty. While critics saw Federal 1 as a waste of taxpayer dollars, Federal 1 consumed a mere $27 million of the WPA's lifetime expenditure of $5 billion, or approximately $95 billion in today's currency. Federal 1 would also see the establishment of over 100 performing arts centers in large and small American communities alike. When FDR took office in 1933, he promised a New Deal for every American, which later translated to the employment of 350,000 African Americans, or roughly 15% of all those employed by the WPA. While many politicians and union leaders criticized the WPA for gross inefficiencies and raging cost overruns, a chronic condition that added the word boondoggling to the American lexicon, the WPA offered employment opportunities to millions of desperate Americans during the hardscrabble days of the Great Depression, leaving behind a legacy of schools, roads, dams, and bridges, many of which remain in use to this day, including such iconic structures as the Hoover Dam, the Library of Congress, and the San Francisco Mint. When weapons production began ramping up as the nation edged closer to entering World War II, when unemployment dropped to a lowly 2%, FDR and the federal government began an operational slowdown of WPA projects, eventually shuttering the program in June of 1943, making the WPA a vital lifeline during the darkest days of the worst hard time. The Flint sit-down strike. After the United Auto Workers, or UAW, formed in 1935, American auto workers began a series of sit-down strikes in some of General Motors' smaller plants in Atlanta, Kansas City, and Cleveland the following year, striking for increased wages and improved working conditions during some of the bleakest days of the Great Depression. While the federal government had determined in 1935 that an annual salary of $1,600 was the absolute minimum on which a family of four could survive, GM workers earned a miserable $900, while the company spent a whopping $839,000 on private thugs known as the Black Legion, intent on intimidating UAW members. And when auto workers took control of GM's Flint, Michigan die casting plant on December 30th, 1936, where just 2 sets of dies stamped out the majority of GM's car bodies, The action dropped the auto giant to its knees. GM argued that the strikers were trespassing, yet multiple court orders failed to remove the workers from their sit-down takeover of the Flint facility. Outside supporters supplied the workers with food and other necessities, and when GM turned off the heat to the buildings, the strikers simply wrapped themselves in coats and blankets and hunkered down. On January 11, 1937, police and company thugs tried to cut off the strikers' food supply, resulting in a riot quickly named by strikers as the Battle of the Running Bulls, which injured 16 workers and 11 policemen. Plummeting GM's production of cars from 50,000 units in December to just 125 in February, after Michigan Governor Frank Murphy refused to use force to break the strike. President Franklin D. Roosevelt sent in the National Guard, but the guns of the Guard were not aimed at the striking workers, but at the police and hired goons, in a clear warning to leave the workers alone and for GM to recognize the workers' grievances. Now considered one of the most successful strikes of the 20th century, the 44-day sit-down strike ended on February 11, 1937, when GM President Alfred P. Sloan announced a $25 million pay raise, which in turn saw UAW membership rise from 30,000 to 500,000 members that same year, making the Flint sit-down strike of 1937 the first major win for organized labor in America. The American 1930s. After the high times of the Roaring '20s, by the end of the decade, a confluence of factors led to the stock market crash of late 1929, followed by the Great Depression to follow, including runaway stock speculation, international instability caused by the First World War, and a punishing agricultural slump. During an age before federal oversight or intervention of any kind, as the worst hard time descended upon average Americans, more than 9,000 banks had failed by 1933, depriving many Americans of their savings deposits, while the ranks of the unemployed climbed to 15 million Americans, a full 25% of the total American workforce. Lacking government safety nets, such as unemployment insurance or Social Security benefits for seniors, the consumer economy ground to a deafening halt. In response to the early years of the Great Depression, President Herbert Hoover maintained a hands-off policy that only worsened the nation's plight, believing that crazy and dangerous Wall Street speculators were responsible for the nation's woes. As more and more Americans lost their homes and farms to foreclosures and bank failures, shantytown encampments became known as Hoovervilles, named so as a direct insult to Hoover's laissez-faire response to the national crisis. To make matters worse, the Dust Bowl comprised yet another man-made disaster when farmers in the Plain States overtilled grasslands without planting tree breaks to block prairie winds, forcing 2.5 million Americans to abandon their farms in what became known as the Dirty 30s. Other natural disasters compounded the nation's woes, including the 1935 Category 5 Labor Day hurricane that ravaged the Florida Keys, followed by a second Cat 5 hurricane that tore through New England in 1938. Sweeping the presidential election of 1932, after Franklin D. Roosevelt took office the following year, he implemented his first and second New Deal policies to help a nation retake its feet, in his words, to wage a war against the emergency. Ending Prohibition on December 5, 1933, FDR pushed the Emergency Banking Act through Congress before signing the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, or TVA, which allowed the federal government to build dams along the Tennessee River for flood control and the generation of inexpensive hydroelectric power, followed by the National Industrial Recovery Act. During his second New Deal, FDR steered the Social Security Act through Congress, at the same time creating the Works Progress Administration, or WPA, injecting federally funded jobs for the unemployed, which in turn improved the American infrastructure through the construction of post offices, bridges, schools, highways, and parks. While the 1930s was an undeniably tough time for most Americans, the nation also took time to play as best they could. By 1938, for instance, more than 80% of American households had radios, with such comedy distractions as Amos and Andy, along with soap operas, sporting events, and the news, while the swing era and the jazz age took the nation by storm, with bands such as Benny Goodman, Fletcher Henderson, Count Basie, and Duke Ellington. Cocktail lounges and bar rooms flourished after the days of illegal speakeasies, while Hollywood entered its golden age with films like The Wizard of Oz, It's a Wonderful Life, and Casablanca. By the end of the decade, as the winds of war escalated, even before Adolf Hitler's 1939 invasion of Poland, American industrial might ramped up to produce the weapons of 20th century mechanized warfare, which in turn raised the nation out of depression during the 1940s and beyond, making the American 1930s a time of trial and tribulation for Americans everywhere.